So, hello everyone. Can you see the screen now? Yep, okay, good. This is a presentation webinar for the Center for Future Consciousness. And this webinar series is the evolution of science fiction. And what we're here today for is the first module, what is science fiction? Now, in case you missed the introduction, we had a webinar on the entire webinar series about 2 weeks ago, and it will be going up on YouTube in case you want to see the introduction. And if you need to find it, you could just email me and I will send you the link. It isn't up there yet, but it will be up there. But today we're going to go into module 1, which is what is science fiction. This is our starting point. And I'm Tom Lombardo, and I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm also a fellow and executive board member of the World Future Study Federation. And the Center for Future Consciousness publishes a bi-monthly newsletter, Future Consciousness Insights, which you can subscribe to by going to the website. And here are a number of my books. My background is in psychology, philosophy, history, the study of wisdom, future studies, and a lifelong passion and interest in science fiction. And the books I have up here deal with future studies, the future of science and technology, wisdom, future consciousness, the psychology of perception. So my interests over the decades have been rather diverse, and in particular, as I just mentioned, I've had a lifelong fascination with science fiction. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And this webinar series is based upon a series of books that I am writing, Science Fiction, the Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. Volume 1, Prometheus to the Martians, has already been published. Volume 2, The Time Machine to Metropolis and Superman to Star Maker, are completed and will be published soon. Volume 4, The Golden Age to the New Wave, and Volume 5, Star Wars to the Singularity and Beyond, I am presently working on. This book series, which as far as I know, is the most comprehensive, expansive history of science fiction that I have seen anybody write, is based upon a course on the history of science fiction, or the evolution of science fiction, that I've been developing over the last 15 years. So what you're going to be getting throughout this webinar series is an online version of a course based upon a book series that I have been evolving since around 2000 to 2005. And I think it's a very comprehensive and detailed and philosophical look at the past of science fiction and even into the future of science fiction. And I'm going to be doing this webinar and the next webinar free. But after these 2 free samples, my plan is to start to charge for the webinar. And right at the moment, what we're thinking is if you want to attend individual webinar events in this series, they will be $25 a piece, so you know this ahead of time, but that's not to the 3rd module. And if you're interested in buying the whole package and participating in the whole package, it'll be $275 for all 16 webinars in this series. And the whole series is going to be 16 webinars, such as the one today. Now, when we do each of these webinars, I'm going to have up some questions that I'd like you to think about that are relevant to the particular webinar that we're going to be going through. And we can talk about these in depth when we come to the question and answer in the middle and the question and answer at the second half. And the questions I have up for today are, what is science fiction? I'm going to tell you what I think it is, but I'd like to hear what you think it is, and if you agree or disagree with me. And why is science fiction so popular and influential? I'm going to talk about that too, and you may have some additional ideas to input into that question. And then third, what is the value of science fiction in understanding reality and the future and guiding us in the future? And you, in fact, may think that there are things about science fiction that are not of value or are counterproductive, and we could talk about those too. But that will be something that we will talk about, I'll talk about to begin with, and then we can talk about during question and answers. And that third question is going to come up over and over again as I go through this series. As what are we learning here from the history and the evolution of science fiction that is going to be helpful for us to understand reality, not just the future, but reality, as well as the future, and guiding us with respect to the future? Why is it so valuable in that regard? So to begin, yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds, as ours are to those beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us.
Target is indicated. Target as indicated.
I think we should try to make them understand we mean them no harm.
There's another machine coming out.
They are living creatures out there.
They're not human. Dr. Forrester says they're some kind of advanced civilization.
If they're more advanced than us, they should be nearer the Creator for that reason.
Moving target. Prepare to follow up.
No real attempt has been made to communicate with them, you know.
Let's go back inside, Uncle Matthew.
I've done all I can in there. You go back. Sylvia. I like that Dr. Forrester. He's a good man.
Attention all batteries. Prepare for volley fire. B. Prepare for volley fire.
Who's that?
What's he think he's doing?
Too late now. It's too far away. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You've seen him. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Those shells can't get through to them. They put out some sort of electromagnetic covering, a protective blister.
a little film clip from the 1953 version of The War of the Worlds. And I saw that movie when I was 6 years old. And that particular scene that you just watched has a lot of interesting aspects to it. Among them, George Pal, who was the producer of the movie, was a significant Hollywood figure in the early years of science fiction movies in the 1950s. But you'll also notice in there, which we will talk about at some point, there's a face-off, literally, between aliens from Mars and their super technologies and a priest who is a man of God. And that is a theme that we will see crop up in all different kinds of ways throughout the history of science fiction. The War of the Worlds as a novel was written by H.G. Wells in 1895, and this 1953 version just totally charged me up as a 6-year-old. And indeed, it created what I would call a total person immersion. As a psychologist, when I think about the different dimensions of the human mind, we can consider emotion, motivation, perception, thinking, learning, our social reality, creativity, imagination, expansion of consciousness. This movie and other science fiction movies that I have up on the screen here that I watched as a kid in the 1950s impacted me in all those different dimensions. Now, this is something very significant about science fiction in that it immerses one's total consciousness and psychology in the experience of either reading it or writing it. It hits us at an emotional level, at an intellectual level, at a perceptual level. And up here, as I mentioned, I have some of the key movies of that decade that as a kid I watched. And in fact, after I watched The War of the Worlds, I decided that I was going to write a story about aliens invading the Earth and actually put out a play with some of my friends, which never came to pass. But it did impact me, as I said, throughout my entire psyche, my entire consciousness. And that's a very significant aspect of science fiction. Indeed, here we have the four main characters from the TV series, The Big Bang Theory: Sheldon, Rahesh, Sheldon, and Leonard walking across the California desert dressed up in Star Trek outfits heading for a comic convention. And these four characters experience science fiction as a way of life. That is, they watch science fiction movies, they talk about the science fiction movies they watch them repeatedly over and over again. They play all kinds of science fiction video games. They read science fiction superhero comic books and collect them and talk about them as well. They dress up in science fiction outfits. They have science fiction art and toys throughout their apartments. And Sheldon has as his ego ideal Mr. Spock from Star Trek. That's who he identifies with. His friends, though, on the other hand, think that Sheldon perhaps is either an alien or a robot. So science fiction permeates through their life. It's the framework in which they experience reality. And in fact, oops. Something happened. There you go. Okay. To use an expression from Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science, science fiction is a paradigm for living and understanding reality. Here we have some images of science fiction fans at science fiction conventions, which zip by all of a sudden on me. But the really classic example of fans who live, breathe, and identify with science fiction are the Trekkies. And the Trekkies, who identify with the entire Star Trek series of which there were many different ones, really feel part of the Star Trek science fiction experience. So science fiction and examples like Star Trek and going to conventions and dressing up in the outfits, for lots of people, is indeed a immersive experience where people get their personal identity from having participated in it. And here's an image from the movie Trekkies. Now, although one could see science fiction as a lot of fun, experiencing it from the point of view of Star Trek or Star Wars, etc. Recently, I wrote an article in Human Futures magazine called Growing in Wisdom Through the Corona Apocalypse as a Character in a Science Fiction Novel. And in fact, science fiction, in this case here, science fiction disaster novels and stories about great epidemics or pandemics can inform and guide us in terms of the reality we see around us and, in fact, how to live through it. In this case, how to live a wisdom narrative as a science fiction character in a disaster novel. And so I have a quote up here from John Clute, historian of science fiction. Everything else is looking more like science fiction, and science fiction is looking more like everything else. So although we can have a lot of fun with the experience of science fiction, and we can have a lot of fun in living a life that's immersed in science fiction can actually provide a framework and a set of ideas for how to understand the world around us, because in the case right now, we're living through a pandemic, a disaster, which is something that has been envisioned repeatedly so throughout the history of science fiction. Now, let's come particularly to this issue of the popularity of science fiction. It's a way of life. Lots of people participate in it. Indeed, it is the most visible, popular, and influential contemporary form of futurist thinking and imagination in the modern world. More people know about science fiction as a way of coming at the future than any other discipline, any other approach to the future. Science fiction permeates out into our culture and impacts us more so than future studies or any other way of coming at and thinking about the future. And part of the reason for this is something I've already introduced, in that it engages the intellect and imagination, emotion, motivation, your senses, your behavior. It motivates you. It addresses values and ethics. It hits you at a personal level, a social level, a cosmic level pertaining to the future. That is, all the dimensions of the human mind are tapped into in science fiction, total person immersion. And indeed, I would say that because it speaks to the whole person, stimulating and enhancing all the dimensions of human consciousness of the future, it stimulates holistic future consciousness. And that is key to its popularity and to its influence. Now, what do I mean by holistic future consciousness? Well, I have a whole book on it, Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution. And holistic future consciousness is simply the total integrative set of psychological processes and modes of experience and behavior involved in our consciousness of the future, including emotion, motivation, thinking, imagination, and personal identity. A thing to just highlight here to make the point about why science fiction is so influential is that it's not simply an intellectual pursuit, in that it affects you and impacts you emotionally and personally, as well as intellectually, and as well as your cognitive processes of the mind. So because it does that, because it gets to your heart and to your senses, as well as to your intellect and imagination, it affects all aspects of our future consciousness. Now, future consciousness is our most empowering and distinctive human capacity, I believe. which I discuss in my book, Future Consciousness. And indeed, it's what drove the purposeful evolution of society and the human conscious mind. And science fiction has a unique and increasingly powerful role in the ongoing purposeful evolution of future consciousness. So I believe future consciousness in all of us is something that is in a process of evolution, and science fiction is driving that evolutionary process. It is stimulating our whole minds with respect to our consciousness of the future. Now, one thing about it that in particular is responsible for this holistic total immersion effect is that science fiction is narratives or stories. It's not abstract theories, it's not experiments, rather it's narratives. And narratives have a powerful impact upon the human mind. The human mind resonates to the story because stories provide us with a sense of identity, a sense of meaning, a sense of value, a sense of purpose. They engage us much more so than an abstract paper will or a paper that's filled with data. That is, when we have stories, stories are what psychologically most resonate with us deep down inside. And in science fiction, you live and vicariously feel the future through the stories. So as a definition, and we'll expand on this, but as an opening definition for science fiction, I would say that science fiction is at least a narrative approach to the future involving settings, sequences, dramas, varied and unique characters. To a significant degree, it's informed and inspired by science and contemporary thought, and it's imaginative and highly detailed scenario building and thought experiments about the future, set in the form of stories and more. Because what I will say a bit later, in fact, it doesn't come up really until the next module, is that science fiction is actually about more than just the future, although the future has been its primary area of focus. So science fiction stimulates and evolves holistic future consciousness, creating for many a total way of life and a paradigm for the future through narratives of the future. Now, holistic future consciousness, as it is embodied within science fiction, runs across many different dimensions. And I just want to go through them so that you can get a feel for how rich and expansive science fiction future consciousness is. Number one, we're all familiar with the idea that science fiction is literature. It's stories and novels. And I have up here a 3-volume series, The Science Fiction Hall of Fame, which indeed I would highly recommend to everyone who is interested in science fiction to read. This 3-volume series contains stories and novellas that were voted by the science fiction writers of America as the greatest science fiction stories ever written up through 1965. And even though that's a bit dated, that does give you a great introduction to the literature of science fiction from H.G. Wells up to Roger Zelazny. On the other hand, I also could recommend, if you want to go look on my website, I have an evolving all-time best science fiction novels. And in fact, that contains hundreds and hundreds of novels that I have rated and recommended as a way to get into understanding the comprehensive, expansive literature of science fiction. But that's only one dimension of holistic future consciousness. A second dimension is the social dimension. Science fiction fandom, the social reality of science fiction, is something that emerged very early on in science fiction and has been around now for at least 100 years. And here's various images representing science fiction fans, including an image in the middle there of the early Futurians. And in there, there are pictures of Isaac Asimov when he was young and Frederick Pohl when he was young. Often science fiction writers start off as science fiction fans. And so there is this immense science fiction community, a social reality to science fiction consciousness spread across the entire globe. In fact, to make a joke of it, here's a collection of various science fiction fans that you may be familiar with, at least in terms of the kinds of imagery and icons that the fans will dress up in terms of. Now, another dimension is that science fiction has multiple conventions. It has multiple awards. It has a Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And so science fiction gets fans together in different places throughout the globe on an annual basis and give out awards for the best things that are written over the last year. And I have up here images of the Hugo, the Nebula, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, the John Campbell Award, and some images from various conventions. So we have that social dimension. Now, science fiction has thousands of websites. The World Wide Web is exceedingly populated with science fiction. And up there, I should just mention, if you want a really great web resource for science fiction, the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction is fantastic. It's a great online resource for science fiction in the form of an encyclopedia. But that's another dimension to science fiction, which is on the internet, on the web. But going back 100 years now, science fiction became part of the comics, originally with Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and then Superman and various other early superheroes, and evolved even further with Spider-Man and the Hulk and Captain America and X-Men and Batman. So science fiction worked its way into the comics very early on as one dimension of visualization of science fiction themes and ideas. And when we come up to the 60s, we have Stan Lee with Marvel Magazine further evolving this visual dimension of science fiction. And as I mentioned, the characters from the Big Bang Theory really get into the comic book dimension of science fiction and the characters in it. A very noteworthy event, phenomena within comics and graphic novels is Watchmen. Watchmen was originally written as a very big graphic novel, big comic book back in the 1980s. Interestingly, when the staff of the New York Times did a vote on the 100 best novels, English-speaking novels of the 20th century, this big comic book came in at number 18. This comic, this graphic novel, is an extreme expression of the level of quality, imagination, and intelligence that has evolved in the comic book graphic dimension of science fiction. And we'll talk about Watchmen. Now, back in 1938, turning to another dimension, radio, Orson Welles, who was not related at all to H.G. Wells, spooked out the nation on the radio by doing, in fact, a reenactment of the Martians invading New Jersey in this case. And lots of people, in fact, believed it. So science fiction got into the electronic media very early on, and I'll even talk afterwards about how it got into movies and cinema very early on too. But as soon as TV took off, we had science fiction TV series, beginning like with Captain Video and his Video Rangers back in the early 1950s. And over the last 70 years, science fiction has permeated TV. In fact, it's become even more popular as the decades have gone on. More recently, we see The Man in the High Castle, Black Mirror, The Handmaid's Tale, and American Gods being made into TV series. And in the last couple of years, I have up here 4 noteworthy TV science fiction series: The Expanse, Westworld, The Umbrella Academy, and Devs. And all of these have significantly involved special effects. All of them have very intelligent and thoughtful plots and characters. And so science fiction is definitely part of the TV scene of TV consciousness. And in fact, people are watching right now, the Westworld series is the most recent example of a popular science fiction TV series. But aside from radio, comics, another dimension, and TV, another dimension of holistic consciousness, holistic future consciousness with science fiction is science fiction art. Science fiction art is something which has evolved since the time of Alba Rabida in the 19th century, and there are some very accomplished, inventive, creative, arresting science fiction artists who have painted and produced covers for a variety of different, obviously different science fiction novels. Science fiction art is another whole dimension of holistic consciousness. And up here I have pictures by Frank Frazetta, Virgil Finlay, Hans Bach, Giger, Richard Powers, who was a kind of Salvatore Dali of science fiction, Chesley Bonestell, who did some very realistic outer space, Kelly Freas. So we'll be looking at some of that as we go through the series too, and how science fiction art, the visualization of science fiction through this medium, has been very significant as well. And of course, there are science fiction videos by the hundreds, if not thousands, that people participate in for thousands of hours. Indeed, we have the novel Ready Player One, a science fiction novel, which was written about a character who was involved in playing video games that was then made into a movie in which the video game experience through special effects becomes part of the movie. So the different dimensions of holistic future consciousness and science fiction get woven together in different types of ways. And I'm not even mentioning up here the fact that there's also science fiction music too. As I mentioned with the Big Bang Theory characters, there are science fiction toys, science fiction paraphernalia, science fiction clothing, science fiction collectibles. That is, one can decorate one's house in science fiction. And at some point, I'll even show you my science fiction room, which is entirely decorated in science fiction books, science fiction figures, and science fiction art. And that's another dimension to the reality of science fiction and the holistic consciousness of science fiction. Now, the biggest impact and the most significant dimension in terms of pop culture regarding science fiction has been science fiction cinema. Back about 4 or 5 years ago, I put up this slide of recent science fiction movies. And I put it up just about the time that Ex Machina came out, which must have been about 2015, and as well as Mad Max. And about a year later, I had to do the course again and realized that I needed to add some more movies because a whole slew of new movies had come out, science fiction movies, in that last year. I should mention up here, though, as interesting science fiction movies that maybe you haven't watched because they haven't been as popular, but still very interesting, are The Machine and The Europa Report. And if you haven't seen the new Mad Max, Fury Road, that one is also extremely good, much better than the other Mad Max from 20 years back. But I had to put up a new slide, a new set of images, because here we have this whole new set of science fiction movies that came out within 1 year. A couple new Star Wars and Arrival and Passengers and Deadpool and another Star Trek and Superman and Batman duking it out. And then within another 6 months, I had to put up another set of science fiction movies that became popular. The next Star Wars, a redo of Blade Runner, the next installment in the new Planet of the Apes series, and Wonder Woman, and Guardians of the Galaxy. And indeed, in the last 4 or 5 months, I put up another slide because, in fact, in the last 6 months, we have a whole new bunch of science fiction movies. The last installment, presumably, of Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, some more Avengers superhero movies, another Godzilla movie, and Godzilla movies just have come out and come out and come out by the dozens over the years. And indeed, I also put up here The Wandering Earth, which is a Chinese science fiction movie that was dubbed in English and came out on Netflix. And that's a rather fascinating movie in that the mindset, the creativity of it, you could see that it was informed by a different culture from simply the American Hollywood culture. And so going through this quick review of movies, which I'll spend a lot more time on, if you're interested, I have up, besides my best science fiction novels, I have up my best science fiction movies on my website as well. And the movies in particular have had a big impact upon human consciousness and pop culture. And science fiction movies, as I mentioned in the opening webinar event, have become the biggest money-making movies of all time for the last 40 years running. So I think that brings me, oh no, one last slide. Scholarship. Science fiction has become, since the 1930s at least, conscious of itself. And there have been many books written by science fiction writers and historians and futurists about what science fiction is all about. Science fiction has journals, it has various conventions where there's discussions going on about science fiction novels, about the writers. And here's just a sampling of books that you could buy, books you can get, that talk about science fiction, that talk about the history of science fiction and what science fiction is all about and what the best stuff is to read in science fiction. So there's a lot of research that's been done, a lot that's been written about science fiction itself and about considerations regarding what science fiction is all about. Here's some more images. And in fact, one thing that's emerged, say, since about the 1940s is that various editors will collect together what they consider to be the best science fiction stories of the year and publish them in anthologies. And so you can go to your local bookstore and you can get books on what were the best things that came out this last year, the best things that came out the year before. And science fiction editors and science fiction fans have been collecting together what they consider to be the best science fiction written during the particular last year. So there's plenty of anthologies around too. That brings me to the end of part one. And that last part of part one basically had to do with all the different dimensions of human consciousness, of holistic future consciousness that get stimulated, that get tapped into, and how through all these different dimensions of science fiction, from literature to visualization to the cinema to the radio to TV to video games to fans and conventions and awards. So at that point, we'll stop. We're still going to come at the question some more about what is science fiction. I've given you definition. I've given you a couple of different definitions. That it's a way of life, and it narratives of the future. You feel and you experience them vicariously. Taps into all the dimensions of holistic future consciousness. Now let's come at the question a slightly different way. And for this, I'm going to go back to the person who popularized the expression science fiction, Hugo Gernsback. And there he is. And Gernsback was a techno-enthusiast, immigrant from Luxembourg, who came to the United States and was interested in radio and all different kinds of emerging electronic technologies, and began publishing a magazine which was also had a mail order catalog, and it called Modern Electrics, back toward the end of the first decade of the 20th century. And Gernsback published as a series in Modern Electrics a science fiction story that became very famous called Ralph 124C41 Plus, a novel of the year, a romance of the year 2660. And this novel contained in it an incredible number of predictions, technological predictions of the future. And it also is generally considered an extremely boring and poorly written novel. But Gernsback was very enthusiastic about the possibilities of technology in the future and how science and technology were transforming the world. And he liked the idea of trying to educate people about the wonders of the future of technology and science through stories. And so he wrote this novel and he published it in Modern Electrics. Modern Electrics evolved into the Electrical Experimenter, his second magazine. And Electrical Experimenter had essays about future technologies. In fact, up there you could see his vision of the visual cell phone back in 1915, or whenever that Electrical Experimenter came out. And from there, the magazine next evolved into Science and Invention. And in there, he started to publish even more stories highlighting the future of science and technology. He used the expression scientifiction to describe these stories. And on one of the covers here on Science and Invention, he uses the expression scientific fiction with an image of the classic science fiction story, The Man from the Atom. But Gernsback in 1926 started the first magazine solely devoted to publishing science fiction stories, which was called Amazing Stories. And there's a cover of the first issue, and it's an image from Jules Verne's novel Off on a Comet. And if you could figure out what's going on there, you could write me on chat and tell me, because I know what is going on there, because it's a very strange image. In fact, it was painted by Frank Paul, who became the first great science fiction artist of the 20th century. And Gernsback in Amazing Stories continued to use the expression scientifiction. But Gernsback was a shit. And Gernsback didn't pay his writers, or paid them very poorly. In fact, he had a really hostile relationship with H.G. Wells. He had a hostile relationship with H.P. Lovecraft, with Edgar Rice Burroughs. And eventually his creditors got together and sued him and forced him into bankruptcy. And so he had to turn over ownership of Amazing Stories, but he wanted to publish another magazine containing the same kind of stories. And so he came out with Science Wonder Stories, but he didn't think he could use the expression scientifiction because he thought it was in some way the property of Amazing Stories, which he no longer owned. So he had to come up with a new expression so he didn't get into legal trouble. So on the cover of the October issue of Science Wonder Stories, for the first time on a cover of a magazine, and you'll see it down there in the right-hand corner, the expression science fiction is used. And that's how the genre got its name, from Gernsback and Science Wonder Stories. Gernsback believed that science fiction, as he grew to understand it, was to entertain and educate through stories on the future of science and technology. That was his conception. Now, that conception is very narrow. He published, of course, various stories that dealt with that topic, but he published lots of stories that went way beyond that, than simply the future of science and technology. But he clearly understood that in order to educate and stimulate people's minds on the future of science and technology, you had to entertain them. And that's part of what I was talking about in the first half of this presentation. So he was looking for good stories that grabbed your attention, and sometimes the focus was on science and technology, but sometimes it wasn't so much at all. And indeed, I will always use as an illustrative example of how Gernsback was so wrong, the classic science fiction story by Roger Zelazny called A Rose for Ecclesiastes. Now, this is the cover of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction where that story first appeared. And it is a painting of one of the great science fiction artists, Hans Bach. And this story is in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and it was voted as being one of the 10 best science fiction stories ever written. And the story takes place on Mars, and we have a linguist who is a scholar who goes to Mars to study the culture and language of the Martian civilization, and is a cold and unemotional human being who is tempted into a sexual erotic relationship with a Martian, Braxa, who's on the cover here. And Braxa tempts him into this relationship because the Martians have become infertile and they need some new seed in their biological line. And he becomes a fulfillment of a prophecy in Martian mythology. And he has a biologist, a geneticist, create a rose that he gives to Braxa. This story has a little bit of science and technology in it. And of course, it takes place on Mars. But the focus of this story is philosophical, cross-cultural, psychological. That is, it is a highly well-developed humanistic narrative that is set in the context of the future in Mars. So it clearly goes way beyond simply talking about the future of science and technology. In this case, it's talking about the scholarly mind and different cultures and love and seduction and mythology and prophecy. And of course, Ecclesiastes is a book out of the Old Testament, and there's a connection there with that as well. So that's a really good example of how science fiction definitely transcends simply the future of science and technology. An even better example on a vaster scale is Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos, which was 4 novels written through the 1980s and 1990s. And in those novels, we find the themes of immortality, stellar networks, philosophers and poets, bioengineering, incredibly diverse ecologies, supercomputers, the rise and fall of civilizations, including the rise of the Catholic Church to dominance across the globe, reincarnation, the second coming, archetypes of good and evil, a debate between the Grand Inquisitor and the Dalai Lama. That is, the Hyperion Cantos covers the full breadth, culturally, psychologically, ecologically, politically, scientifically, of the future. In this case here, it's set in the 29th century. And in this case, we could say science fiction facilitates an integrative understanding of the future, integrative. So all the dimensions of human reality, and more than just humans in this, because we have the Shrike there in the middle who is not human, or maybe he is human, I won't tell you, drawn together into an image of the future in all of those different dimensions. And this is not something unique to Hyperion. Back in the 19th century, Albert Robida wrote The 20th Century, which was a slice of life extremely prescient in its predictions of the 20th century, in which he talked about all the dimensions of human reality in Paris, in fact, as the central focus. But it's a very comical and crazy and interesting novel, but it's a novel about the future of everything from the point of view of the 19th century. And some other ones that I'll just note up here that are excellent examples of integrative futures of everything include John Brunner's fantastic Stand on Zanzibar, the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, and Matter by Ian Banks. These are all novels, big monstrous novels that talk about human society and the whole ball of wax. But I need to also emphasize in this that although science fiction does hit you at the gut, hits you emotionally, it's also intellectually challenging. It's mentally challenging. It expands your consciousness. Two relatively recent big picture integrative science fiction novels, River of Gods, which takes place in future India, and The Three Body Problem, which takes place in future China, give you culturally expansive visions that go beyond just simply the West, but do so really challenging one's mental powers at the same time, you as the reader. Now, these two are really good examples of that because the writers in both cases are familiar with philosophy, history, science, and weave it together with complex pictures of future cultures and societies in China and in in India. In fact, the Three Body Problem starts off in China in the past and moves to China in the future. The person who really did this exceedingly well was H.G. Wells in The Shape of Things to Come. The Shape of Things to Come is a synthesis, this is written in the early 1930s, a synthesis of in-depth historical analysis of human history, going way back, contemporary analysis of our modern world today, future studies thinking, what are the possibilities for the future, and a narrative that unfolds of the future, which is science fiction. That as Wells in this novel, as well as in other works as well, synthesized historical future scholarship, which was intellectually very challenging, about the big picture of things with a fictional narrative. And this is something that goes on frequently in science fiction, where various ideas about the nature of history and things that go on in history and different futurist extrapolations are woven together with fiction. And they can be mentally very challenging. The Shape of Things to Come, I recommend to people to read because even though it's a big book and it is in a lot of ways very abstract, you can see how Wells pulled together 3 or 4 different disciplines to create a big picture of past, present, and future. Now, speaking of Wells, aside from The War of the Worlds, Wells wrote a number of other great science fiction novels, including his first one, The Time Machine, which I read as a young kid. And I remember when I read it, and I must have been about 12 or 13 at the time, it took me off away from the here and now, because you, of course, go out first hundreds of thousands of years and then millions of years into the future. You realize a level of cosmic consciousness in that novel. And by cosmic consciousness, I mean that when we talk about the future of everything, we can mean all the dimensions of human reality. That's one meaning to the future of everything. But another meaning to the future of everything is the future of the universe, the whole big thing. And when you start to sail out into distant time or distant space, you are realizing a sense, an experience of cosmic consciousness. You are seeing yourself in the context of the ultimate big pictures of reality. Now, that's part of what I mean by science fiction deals with ultimate questions, not just of the future, but of reality. Because in The Time Machine, we go out millions and millions of years to the end of time in our solar system, at least in our solar system. And we achieve a cosmic consciousness. And Olaf Stapleton said it very well: to a romance of the far future is to attempt to see humanity in its cosmic setting and to mold our hearts to entertain new values. The Time Machine is one novel that does that, that realizes cosmic consciousness by getting out of the immediate here and now and journeying out far, in this case into time, but also it could be into space. Now, why do we need that? And I put up here a second very famous science fiction story, Surface Tension, which is also in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame as one of the 10 or 15 best science fiction stories ever written by James Blish. And this story came out around 1950. And in this story, what we have is we have a group of very, very tiny, almost microscopic humanoid creatures who live in a mud puddle, in a little puddle of water. And they believe that that puddle of water is the entire universe. But there's some of them who think there's something beyond the mud puddle and build the ship to get out of the mud puddle, which means breaking through the surface tension of the puddle, but also breaking through the surface tension of their minds, because their culture thinks this is all there is. And eventually, at the end of the story, they break free and find themselves on a rocky shore of this mud puddle and look up into the sky and for the first time see the stars. And they have a cosmic experience. They have broken out of their narrow conception of reality, and reality has been transformed because of that. And this is an allegory on us. The world that we live in is like a mud puddle. It's a mud puddle in the sense both of, it's a very limited slice of reality, and our minds are very constrained and limited in how we see the total scope of reality. And part of the science fiction adventure, part of the power of science fiction is to be able to break out of that mental set, to break out of that narrow reality that we're in, and to see that there's a lot more out there than we ever dreamed or imagined. And another interesting thing about surface tension is it's an incredibly rich and interesting vision of a microscopic ecology within a mud puddle, because there's lots of different creatures down at this level of size. So it's a really good story dealing with ecology on an alien world. Along similar lines, and this is a third example, we have the story Universe by Robert Heinlein. This is also in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. In fact, this is one of the great space exploration stories ever written, and Heinlein being one of the great science fiction writers of all time. And Universe takes place in a giant spherical spaceship, which is journeying from the Earth to some place in outer space to find a new planet to settle. But all the inhabitants of the spaceship have forgotten, have lost their memories, because it's been so many generations they've been in the ship, of where they came from. And they in fact believe the spaceship is the entire universe, until the two-headed man who used to live up there reveals to the people on the ship that indeed they're on a spaceship, and they always thought there was an entire universe, that no, this is just a spaceship you're on. And it's an interesting story about the reconstruction of history, about religion, about cosmic theories. All this goes on in the story about what we believe ultimate reality is, and how we may be very surprised that our visions of ultimate reality don't even come close to the truth. It's another one of those stories that hits the cosmic consciousness level. But I have to put up, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about him, Olaf Stapleton, who was a philosopher in England, who wrote science fiction, and two of his most noteworthy science fiction novels, Last and First Men and Star Maker, written in the 1930s, generate the highest level of cosmic consciousness I have ever seen any science fiction writer produce. Arthur C. Clarke said that Star Maker is the most powerful work of imagination ever written. It definitely seems to be, in my mind, the most powerful work of imagination written in the West. But even before he wrote Star Maker, Last and First Men is a history of the future of humanity that runs out 2 billion years into the future through 18 different species of humans. Star Maker is a history of the future evolution of the universe and cosmic intelligence and the emergence of a cosmic mind that runs out 30 to 50 billion years into the future. So these are cosmic perspectives on a vast, grand scale. And I'll spend some time talking about Stapleton and Wells and some other significant people here that were connected together. Wells and Stapleton knew each other. Stapleton was this incredible mind of imagination. Brian Aldiss said that Stapleton's imagination was a Niagara. And he is the ultimate philosophical and cosmic trip in early science fiction, these novels coming out in the 1930s. So science fiction definitely hits you at a cosmic level and gets you to imagine possible big, immense pictures of reality and the future and evolution through writers such as Heinlein and Wells, and in particular, Olaf Stapleton. So just in summary, science fiction creates total person immersion and a way of life. It's more than just literature, and it hits you at all different psychological levels and not just simply your intellect and imagination. Science fiction is future's narratives, but more. But the fact that it is narrative is psychologically resonant with the way people have an inclination to understand reality through stories. We like stories. Science fiction hits all different dimensions of holistic future consciousness, from cinema, visual, auditory, perceptual, intellectual, literary, social. All those are different dimensions. The fans, the comics, TV, radio. It provides integrative futures of everything, not just simply the future of science and technology like Gernsback believed, but the future of everything from society to ethics. And even in the case of Olaf Stapleton, God gets into the picture there too. And indeed, science fiction will often stimulate or generate cosmic consciousness, so you can look at yourself from hypothetical, possible big pictures, of which there are many different ones, and see yourself, as Spinoza said, through the eyes of eternity, the eyes of the universe. Put yourself in the context of the universe. Put yourself in the context of the big scheme of things, and imagine, well, what are we and how do we fit into all of this? And that's part of science fiction. So our next module is going to be mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. And here's what we have up here, 2 images of Thor and of Star Wars that clearly mix together fantasy, mythology, and science fiction all in the same package. And we'll talk about the differences between mythology, fantasy, and science fiction, and the similarities, especially between what mythology is and what science fiction is. Because as you noticed in the title of my book series, I say that science fiction is the evolutionary mythology of the future. So we'll look into that in a lot more depth. How is science fiction mythology, and how is it evolutionary mythology, and how does it connect with ancient mythology and fantasy? So that brings us to the end today of this first webinar, Module 1, What is Science Fiction?